Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education. Usually we have guests and we talk about maths, but this time we're going to do something a little bit different. With me, I've got Christopher Such.
Hi, yeah, great to be back. Laughing. I think we should keep this in. I think this is fun. This is light.
In between recording interviews with interesting teachers, what we're going to do is we're going to have a chat about some things that are frequently come up in conversations with teachers or that might be of interest. And so the focus of this episode will be number bonds. But the first thing we do is we're going to, oh God, it's terrible. Before anything else, let's introduce you to a segment called What You're Reading For. Christopher, what are you reading for?
What am I reading for? I mean, I love loving the Bill Hicks reference. To throw that out there, I don't think we should leave it unsaid. I think explicit is the way to go. Currently, just this week, there was a recommendation online by Peps McRae. When he says something's worth reading, I tend to follow it up. Read a paper called Cognitive Load and Classroom Teaching, the Double-Edged Sword of Automaticity. It's not the newest paper in the world. I think it's about 2006, 2007. For those people who are interested in cognitive load theory, you can argue it treads on ground that you may have already thought about, but it was actually a welcome reminder of some things I just hadn't been in the forefront of my mind. I think when it comes to thinking about cognitive load theory, I tend to think about children, specifically how to deal with instruction for children, how you might support them understanding things, how and when we might minimize cognitive load. This paper is all about teacher training, which is a really interesting angle on things. I think it still has a lot to say about how to deal with students, but effectively it looks at what it describes as the dual process model of cognition, which is effectively the idea that we operate in two modes. This kind of controlled, conscious, slow, effortful mode where we have to think about exactly what we're doing, and then this kind of automatic, fast, effortless, non-conscious mode where we can just, we can do things without thinking. For those people who are familiar with Daniel Kahneman, that whole thinking fast and slow idea. Anyway, to kind of cut to the chase, the idea behind it was that there are it's important to develop automaticity, but there are issues either way with it. So the positive of developing automaticity is obviously that it frees up cognitive resources when you're dealing with something complex like teaching. But the downside to developing automaticity is that you can develop something that is automatic but isn't necessarily ideal. Those people out there who have tried to learn a new sport like golf will know if you ingrain a bad habit and it becomes automatic, trying to undo that, even with conscious effort, can be a blooming nightmare. So I think that's the key message of the paper, that there's, this idea of automaticity is a bit of a double-edged sword, and that we need to think carefully about how and when we ingrain automaticity in student teachers in particular. Really interesting paper. I highly recommend people check it out. What about you? What have you been tackling this week?
Well, I actually had some stuff prepared on that paper as well, because I found it really interesting.
Yeah, I want to know what you think. This will be fascinating, because you'll probably say, I don't think you've really understood that paper, Chris, which is fine. I want to hear that.
No, I think you have. My first reaction was, why won't they just let us be happy? Because we spend all this time trying to get our teachers to this stage where they're automatic in their behaviors. They've got all this, all the core things down, and then they say, well, actually, no, this is a double-edged sword. But then I thought it's actually probably a bit of a niche concern, because how many teachers are really at that point? If you were to look at the general population, I think you've got a minority who are operating in that realm where they need to stop and think about, am I just acting on instinct, or is this the right thing to do?
It's interesting they talk about it in a teacher training framework, because what you're saying there, I immediately started thinking, oh, okay, the kind of the nastier side almost of this double-edged sword, it's kind of more applicable to the likes of me, who have been teaching for over a decade and still recognize pretty unfortunate ingrained habits that I'm trying to work my way out of, that are unfortunately automatic. So while it may apply to teach training, it's kind of, I think there's a long-term teacher development aspect to this paper as much as it's about initial teachers.
Yeah, totally. I can't really see it applying to it. I'm not sure how experienced you can possibly be after a year. And certainly, when I imagine someone who is doing things automatically, and I'm not. I'm like you said. The first thing I thought was, well, what am I doing stuff like that? Do I need to think about my practice? But then I also think, that's possibly why thinking has stood out to me as something to really focus on, because it is about, using the right tool at the right time. And you asked if I'd been reading anything. I've actually been reading Making Kids Clever by David Dye. And I thought the two tied really well together, because the whole idea of purposeful practice, and then rehearsing the right things sort of comes across really strongly. And, I've always said that I don't see much difference between learning to teach and learning in the classroom. And it's possibly because of that, practicing the right things, and trying to go beyond competency in an idea. And again, I think with a dose of thinking, that's where we stop ourselves from falling into a trap. Because I reckon it is probably the most experienced teachers listening who will read this paper and think, right, okay, am I acting on impulse, or is this the best thing for my kids? But I can't imagine anything before 4 or 5 years. There may be outliers, but I just can't see it. But in terms of Making Kids Clever, it feels like a really nice summary of Dai's books to date.
I totally agree. I think it is. It seems like he's put together a lot of the ideas that he's had in the past. I mean, for those people who have read What If Everything, I think it's called What If Everything You Knew About Teaching Was Wrong. For those there might be, I won't say repetition. I think that's possibly unfair on Dai. But there are certain elements in there that you'll recognise. And if you've read that book first, this one might not feel quite so important. I think the way he structures an argument through a book, the way that it develops in a really understandable fashion from start to finish is impressive. I think I may have mentioned this to you before you got to the book, which is possibly unfair. I don't mean to bias your account of it. I don't think I buy into the some of the genetic side of things, particularly relating to Plomin's work, in quite so to the extent that he does. I mean, I understand kind of where Plomin's coming from, in that he's fought for decades even to establish the idea that genes have any kind of impact. So I understand why he's now kind of hammering that idea home. I just don't think that the research, if you look into the kind of twin studies, this sort of thing is quite as cut and dry as Didal makes out. But that isn't a particularly that isn't a massive weakness of the book. Interestingly, I think of all the bits, when I talk about this flowing argument, I think that is a section that you can almost remove, and the argument still works beautifully from start to finish. From we do this, and why do we do this? Because we do that, and why do we do that? Because we do that, from start to finish. And I think we've also said before, he's clearly he's such an enjoyable writer to read. Makes complex things simple. So yeah, it's well worth a read, I think.
Yeah, the analogies in it are great, and some of the examples. And certainly, whenever I read it, I know that I don't have the background reading to make any sort of judgment on how accurate, anything on genes and stuff might be. And so I was focusing really, when I read it, on the sort of the stuff that's applicable to teaching and learning. And I think that's always really well researched, so almost like rigorously trawl through the sources to make sure that they're as reliable as possible. And then I was thinking about whether or not I would have preferred to read this book first or the wrong book, because the wrong book is a total shock, it's a jolt to the system. And he really shocked, there were shockwaves going through the education world when, was it 2014, when that book came out. And I've read it maybe 4 times. and still haven't really got to the bottom of it. But when I read it, I remember thinking, here are lots of things that we've been doing that we shouldn't be doing that I agreed with. But there were also a fair amount of things I thought, no, hold on, he's not right here. And then only over time going back to it. Whereas I think this book, in Making Kids Cleverer, is a more gentle mode of ingress into those big ideas, ideas which are pretty commonplace now, but weren't necessarily 6 years ago. So it's really interesting. I think I'd probably recommend it to new teachers. But if you're older and perhaps less malleable to new ideas, then I'd point you towards What If Everything You Knew About Education Was Wrong, because it's a kick up the backside. So it depends what you want, but both are really extremely well written, and it was really enjoyable, even though I was familiar with quite a lot of the education-based, source material. And it was a pleasant ride from start to finish.
I mean, just one last thing almost on that gene stuff. I mean, the worst case scenario with something like that is that it's provocative and you go and read further, which is, when I read that book, I have to admit, I was astonished. I mean, I ended up in a brief, he was generous enough to have a very brief back and forth with me. It was one of the first conversations I ever had on Twitter, but it made me go away and read more about the subject of twin studies, in particular relating to genetic research. And so worst case scenario, the stuff you disagree with is provocatively written enough that it makes you think, well, I need to know whether this is true or not. I need to know whether I fully agree with it. But no, really enjoyable read.
Cool. So then our attention turns now to, I suppose, the main theme of this group of episodes. How do you solve a problem like, and this week it's how do you solve a problem like number bonds? Indeed,
something very close to my heart. I figure if you don't mind, I'm going to start it off with let's not pretend otherwise. We've prepared some questions, but I'm going to throw the first one at you, which is, okay, I'm going to give you actually I think the hard bit. Just sum it up for us. What are number bonds? Before you answer, though, I'm just going to quickly say I saw a Twitter thread the other day where a chap in his, I guess, 50s and 60s was looking at number bonds and immediately said, ugh, why don't they just call them sums anymore? So I'd like you to, in your answer, I'd like you to kind of somehow put that chap's mind to rest, that either there's a reason why number bonds as a phrase means something that sums doesn't. Go for it.
It's a super question. And when I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, this is my first chance for Chris to be truly disappointed in me whenever I give a subpar answer. But I thought the first thing that you see, for instance, if you Google what is a number bond, you will see it's when you add two numbers together and you get a given value. And I think, and I did some counting, 6 out of the 11 on the first page of Google give that response, which is pretty disappointing because A, most people know that, and B, it's not helpful to anyone who really wants to know what a number bond is. So without would it be any sort of backing from anyone, I think they are a representation of the composition of number, and in particular, you're moving towards a mental representation of those relationships that are contained within a given value. For instance, the fact that 4 is 2 and 2, but it's also 1 and 3 or 0 and 4. And so, I think at its core, it's a representation of a relationship, but the relationship is undefined until you identify, it's almost like atoms. It's only when you identify one of the parts does the full relationship become clear, I think.
Love it. I mean, that's a much more academic sounding answer than I would have ever come up with. I mean, because my view, when I saw this chap talk about, is it just sums? Well, there's part of me that sees the nature of number bonds being more about, again, I think there's a colloquial nature to this, in that we use it in different ways. and it ends up taking on not a really precise definition. But the way I think of number bonds is more like number relationships, like you say. So I think of the fact that 3 and 6 go together make 9 isn't merely a sum. It isn't just 3 plus 6 or 6 plus 3. It's also contained within it 9 minus 6 or 9 minus 3. So it's kind of those relationships. It's also the fact that I would see if someone said, "Oh, I'm working out 347 add 2,792," and that's a sum, no doubt about it. But I wouldn't, and you could consider it a number bond. It obviously could be if you thought it worthwhile. But really, when we're talking in a pedagogical sense about number bonds, we're also talking about the stuff where we think, no, I want children to have this in a way that's more accessible. This is like the number facts, or better to put it, number relationships that I want them to take to another level of accessibility beyond, I can calculate it with a pen and paper, or even I can calculate it in my head, but there are several steps. So whereas we might talk about number bonds inside 10, inside 20, or number bonds 2 or to 100, etc., how often would we talk about number bonds to 3,924 or whatever? There's a sense in which we're talking about the valuable core number facts, I think, at least in the way that I've seen teachers use number bonds. What do you reckon? Is that kind of, do you think that kind of goes along nicely with your slightly more academic view, which was, impressive, I have to admit?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because I think relationships is key. I was trying to think whether or not it would be classified as a structure, because subtraction through number bonds or through finding the bond, in whatever case, for instance, finding the bond of 10 can often be one of the structures that we point children towards. But yeah, I think it's about how those component parts behave with each other, and that can be whatever size you want. And like you said, seeing things and seeing patterns, because 37 and say 1,037, there's only a very small jump really whenever you're operating with those kind of numbers, I think. But I suppose you almost start to answer the next bit. Why are they important?
This I think ties in quite nicely with what we were talking about earlier with regards to automaticity and cognitive load. I think it comes down to the key reason why having a real grasp of number bonds and having them to a level of automaticity over a long period of time, why that becomes so valuable is because of all the ways in which you come to use these number bonds, these number facts in other areas of mathematics. And if you are still having to, say, calculate 7 plus 5 is 12, if you're still having to calculate that by counting on or through other means, rather than just knowing it or being very close to just knowing it like that, then so much of your cognitive resources is taken up by doing that. How many times have we seen children doing something like written addition, and they do 7 plus 5, and they work out that it's 12, and they maybe put everything in the right place, but then they're just lost on what to do next because they haven't been able to concentrate on the algorithmic procedure. They just haven't been able to concentrate on it because they've been devoting so much mental resources to working out 7 plus 5. And it's easy to think of it as, well, is it just written addition? Is it just then, written subtraction that they're useful for? But it goes so much further than that. If you think, going back to 7 plus 5, if you're looking at angles around, adjacent angles around a point on a straight line, and you've got, there's an angle of 70, an angle of 50, and an angle that's missing, making up the 3, they add to 180, and knowing that 7 plus 5 is 12, and thus 70 plus 50 is 120, and thus the missing number is 60 degrees, is so much easier to keep that whole process in mind if you know 7 plus 5, and thus you're at a stage where 70 plus 50 is pretty much automatic as well. Whereas if you're the kid who's getting out the pencil and paper to work out 70 plus 50, before, and then having to get out the pen and paper to subtract it from that what I did in my head, effectively taking 12 tens from 18 tens. If you're then doing that in your head, with a piece of paper as well, what are your chances of remembering what it is you've got to do at the end of the problem? It's really about making something automatic to free up cognitive resources for later, more complex things you're going to do with those numbers. That's the fundamental reason why bonds are so essential. But what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's a chunk of information that you can easily hold. Um, there are two or three sort of, and I'm going to go back into the academic stuff here, and two or three ways of describing why they're useful. I suppose the first one that I sort of talk about and thinking deeply is the idea of proceptual reasoning, where you're taking the fact that this is much more than just a procedure, or this is much more than a concept. It's almost both melded together. But one of the upsides of COVID is the online CPD, and there is, or there has been, a series of lectures on the Erno Leitinen online colloquium. And in Finland, they've been doing these lectures, once every fortnight since probably October. And two of the talks really stand out. The first one is, and I hope I pronounce this properly, Lieven Verschaffel. And he works in Leuven in Holland, I believe. And he calls it adaptive expertise. And that's having the confidence to look at something and make a decision which is the best or most efficient approach. For instance, if you looked at a subtraction question and decided that, for instance, subtraction is not actually necessary, the fact that you know what the gap is, you know what the difference is because you've got knowledge of a bond. And then the other one was John Starr, where he talks about procedural flexibility. And I think somewhere in the middle of all three of those ideas, you've almost got the reality of the situation, and I mention them because the videos are online, and I think I'll add it to the show notes of this, totally for free, and really, really interesting in terms of, they give examples of their research with, very basic arithmetic, but actually exploring how pupils think about the mathematics, and whether or not that's something that we naturally do, or whether we need primed. And John Starr in particular talks about, well, what is the best method? Can we decide? Can we, assign a value? So I'm 100% with you. And that's why they're important to me, is because of the flexibility they allow later on in the sequence,
When you said proceptual understanding, there was a bit of a flashback to, I can't remember the name of the paper. If that can go in the show notes for me as much as anyone else, because I remember reading about proceptual understanding a few years back, and it's something that had completely slipped from my mind until you mentioned it just there. I remember it being interesting. So it might be something that's across a series of papers. I just remember having read about it somewhere. So if you can dig up that'd be really, really useful. In regards to what you mentioned about I'm not going to try and say the name of the colloquium you mentioned, but yeah, there's some fabulous stuff on there recently. I think Clements and Sarama did a video on there as well, and obviously work that they do on early mathematics is always worth a look. So good answer, Kieran. I like it. So I guess the next stage then, if we're looking at we've discussed why they're important. The next thing is how do you think they are currently taught? And I'm leaning towards not necessarily what you see or what you would advocate, but more across schools generally. What would you say is the modus operandi of most teachers when it comes to dealing with these?
So that's absolutely how I'm going to approach it, and how I imagine, based on time in schools and stuff. I actually was having this conversation with one of our early years leads today, and we were talking about how it doesn't need to be that way. But essentially, I reckon paper and pencils are involved quite a lot, repetition, and perhaps a little less thought as to the sequencing of which bonds and when than is necessary. So that I think, based on, for instance, resources that you see online, that's where I'm drawing that conclusion from, and from just years of being a really bad teacher as well.
I'd say I'm with you on a lot of that stuff there. I mean, I've seen learning objectives go in books which say we like LO to learn number bonds to 10. You think, oh, that's what you're going to do with this hour, is it? And then they're done. Fabulous. I'm looking forward to this lesson. You see teachers trying to attempt them in a single lesson. I think a common thing is to see when you talk about sequencing, I think like specifically issues I've seen in there are particular schemes or just the way teachers attack them, where they say, okay, so we'll learn our number bonds to 10, and then next year we'll learn our number bonds to 20, as if the number bonds to 10 are of any use at all without number bonds to 9, number bonds to 8, number bonds to 7, etc. I mean, I would say alongside that, I agree. I mean, I'm going to get into the if you like, double-edged sword of repetition and how it can be useful and how it might not be in certain cases. But yeah, just lots of, like say, paper and pencil, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but paper and pencil, lots of repetition and some missing, and trying to teach them in a single lesson sometimes is the kind of thing that I have come across as well. I'm not saying that's practice everywhere, but I do think that's a common way of going about it. Yeah, definitely. So I'm trying to think. It's like I believe, not wanting to give the game away too much. Feel free to delete this bit if you like. But probably a good time for you to fire back an equally challenging question.
Yes, and I was just thinking about how to segue. Do the national curriculum and, as you say, schemes perhaps give a false impression of number bonds teaching?
Well, it's funny you should say that. We've obviously discussed these questions a little bit in the past, just through having talked about maths, etc. And if you'd asked me this question a few days ago, I probably would have started having a go at the national curriculum. But to be absolutely sure, I went back and I think I've got an impression that is probably unfair, and that it's actually certain math schemes that are perhaps somewhat misleading. The national curriculum do absolutely say number bonds inside 10, or I think it might say within 10, within 20, etc., which is a perfectly acceptable way to describe it. I think it's certain schemes, certain schools, etc., have interpreted that as we said before, number bonds to 10, number bonds to 20, and have missed out a whole load. And dare I say, missed out some significant chunks of potentially productive pedagogy along the way as well. So does the national curriculum give a false impression? I don't think it probably necessarily does in this area, but I definitely think that from what I've seen, certain schemes, and dare I say schemes that are very strong in other aspects, I'm not going to do the dirty, I'm not going to name names, but that are very strong in other aspects, when it comes to this aspect of their Key Stage 1 or beyond provision, it's a bit ropey in what they say. They do say things like, number bonds to 10, here's this lesson, off you go. Is that your experience? Does that reflect what you see?
I think if a company or organization have taken the time to make a resource, it's perhaps unforgivable that is the case, because those bonds within are so important. And like you said, it's clearly stated. But I can see why teachers would make the very literal interpretations of the national curriculum that they do. For instance, with written subtraction of two numbers, it's almost a case of that's the thing that stands out. That's what we go for. Number bonds to 10, they stand out. Let's go for that. Because of the way the curriculum was introduced. So I remember 2012, we had the consultation, and then almost overnight, we were expected to know how to deliver this curriculum. And perhaps number bond should have been sort of centered what we were doing before. But I think without the support that's necessary, support has been building over, the last 10 years or so, for the sort of the practices that we're trying to develop as a nation. But whether or not that should have been there on day one is another thing, because I remember, levels disappeared and we all had to learn how to teach without levels. So we all repeated what was previously in levels, but give them our own names and our own colors. There were still sub levels, but just not a name. And it's only really after years, it's been a decade basically of discovery. And some of the stuff that's out there now is we really understand the benefit, but that wasn't a shared understanding in 2012, 2013. And so I can totally see why teachers would literally interpret things the way they have and do sometimes, because without the requisite expertise, you will be drawn towards the structure or the sort of the facade that is most easily recognizable, and that is number 1 to 10. And they are important, but as you say, if we go back to the composition of number definition, there's so much more to those what are considered the simple numbers, the easy numbers. But I don't think it's the national curriculum's fault per se.
I mean, I realised that I was kind of under the impression that there was something amiss there, and actually, I don't think there is. In terms of just thinking about how the national curriculum and certain schemes, etc., how people have interpreted certain aspects. I think also in terms of pedagogy, thinking back to the question before a tiny bit as well. I can't help it. I'm going to do this a lot, I imagine, but I have to draw a similarity between this and some of the views that teachers have about learning to read, in that with number bonds, there seem to be certain children, and I'd say it's a decent percentage, maybe 30-40%, you just show them enough, and maybe they've played board games at home, I don't know what it is, you just show them enough, and maybe not even that many, and they've got it, and it's quick, and it's natural. And so you can get the idea that, oh yeah, just a little bit of repetition and we're good to go. In the same way that with reading, there are certain children, you can just read to them and point to the words enough, and they will pick up phonics. They will learn those sound spelling correspondences, and they'll learn what blending and segmenting are, and you're just amazed by it. But this, I think, sadly gives us a false impression that this is something that's the optimal way or even a sufficient way of teaching things for all children. And it's only, I think the reason I thought about this is you were talking earlier about years and years in the profession. It's only when you work with those children that have struggled with this sort of thing for a significant period of time, and then you try other approaches beyond mere repetition, though repetition obviously has value, that go beyond only repetition, that you start to say, oh, wow, hang on a minute. There's something more to this. We can do this in a better way for particular students. So if I may, I'm going to move it on a little bit, because I feel like I'm starting to hint in that direction. How else might they be taught productively? How else might we take number bonds? And I mean, you mentioned earlier about sequencing, and I think that's a really important part of what this involves. But I think there's other aspects to it too. How might we go about how might we go about teaching these in a more productive fashion that maybe benefits all children rather than just a few?
That was a question that even the most hardened conference attendee would have been proud of. That question at the end, that's more of a 30-minute diatribe.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it's going to have to be bullet points to some extent, unless we're going to make like a 5-hour podcast, and I'm not sure anyone wants that.
No, but it's a fantastic question. And actually, some of the stuff you've shown me recently, I think people would really benefit from hearing about. But I think I'm absolutely with you. My own son's 6, so I had an extended bit of time with him during the first lockdown in sort of mid-2020. And because I've worked in schools in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation my whole career, it was the first time I'd really seen, guaranteed someone who had a reasonably affluent background and had that mathematically rich upbringing, like you said, the board games. And so with a little bit of pointing, that's all he needed to memorize the bonds. They were just there, and then we could focus on, the being flexible when we're exploring calculations and stuff when I had to teach him. But typically, we will start with repeated exposure to a visual representation or a concrete representation of those structures. for instance, you will see quite often, for instance, in the sand and the water, you will see things like Numicon, and with a key that unlocks the matching piece. In year one, we continue with the continuous provision up until Christmas, simply because we want to put an emphasis on those fundamentals. And so you will often see that in our year one classes, where they're doing those activities where they're bringing things together, and their attention is being drawn towards the patterns they see. The use of color, for instance. But I think in the first instance, it's seeing that all the time, it becoming a normal part of the environment, and then any opportunities they do have to explore, any focused sort of input from adults, focuses on some sort of concrete representation that they can manipulate, so that they can put them together, and they can see what it looks lined up and across. And then over time, you're almost becoming a bit more explicit between what they're experiencing and the idea, because I'm a bit loath to say that we'd go straight into the abstract numerals too early, because I think you can have a sense of 5 and 5 without being able to write 5 and 5. Like secretarial skills, I make a point in my schools to separate those from the mathematics skills early on, year one, year two, because ultimately, if they can express an idea through a concrete resource, say they had multi-link cubes and they were able to show you, the addition of 3 single-digit numbers, that's much more valuable than being able to write stuff down. They will have, if they struggle to write, they'll have intervention, but ultimately, it's that sense of how those numbers behave together. Like you say, those relationships. And I think it's through multiple repeated exposure to different scenarios with concrete resources. That's almost where I'm going, without being too specific. I think repetition will come. For instance, if there's a child who is maybe 18 months behind at the end of reception, behind what, so say for instance, learning trajectories would consider the typical journey of a neurotypical child, then it may be a case that you give them extra sort of input and stuff. But I think in the first instance, it's about experience. And I think, and you've also alluded to this, it's about, this is going to happen over a long period of time. So if our pupils are 3 years old when they come to nursery, and it's Christmas of year one by the time we expect them to have a fair idea, enough of an idea to be able to manipulate those bonds in mathematics lessons, that's quite a long time.
Would I be right in thinking here that this, not necessarily the pedagogy, but when you're talking about year one specifically, that you're talking kind of bonds specifically with it to and within 10, before that, in like at that stage in year one, before you're not looking at things kind of past 10 in terms of number bonds at this stage? You want them to have real natural flexibility with the bonds inside and to 10 before you're looking at anything kind of beyond that. Would that be true?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I'm aware that this kind of links to our next question as well, where we're talking about the prerequisites. I think actually it makes sense for us to kind of blend these two together in that what are the prerequisites for number bonds? Because the prerequisites for number bonds and the pedagogy of teaching number bonds themselves can't really be separated. There's the lineage of them is just too it's too tightly woven. I think you're absolutely right that it begins with familiarity. I think it begins with number sense, particularly supertizing. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail in supertizing now. I could waffle on for a bit. It's a thing I'm quite interested in. But perhaps that's an episode in and of itself at some point. But effectively, this idea of immediate recognition of groups within 5, and then the ability to recognize groups larger than that based on those initial skills of immediate recognition. I think, like you say, the aspect of color, using things like double-sided counters and 10 frames. Again, for those of you who are not familiar with 10 frames, Google 10 frame, it will come up. It's basically a row of 5 and then another row of 5 in an array of squares that you can put objects inside. So you can start to see 7, depending on how you arrange it, as a 5 at the top and then a 2 at the bottom, or you can see it as 4 and 3 if you arrange it in a different way, etc., etc. And being able to begin to recognize, well, I know that's 4, I know that's 3, and I know from that that's 7. and then the number bonds develop in tandem with the supertizing, and they kind of reinforce one another. I think it becomes interesting when you then go past bonds inside 10, because obviously the bonds inside and 210 they're the building blocks of what comes next. Because I think often for a lot of children, the stumbling blocks are the bonds, kind of, single digit numbers that add up to 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, etc. And again, if you think about, if I think about the ways that I've had success, is going back to their ability to perceptually and conceptually supertize, and then using those skills with 10 frames to start saying things like, well, okay, how do we add, or how might we add 9 plus 7? And so obviously when we come to add 9 plus 7, eventually we want them to go, well, it's 16, isn't it? We just know it. There's kind of an intermediate step that catalyzes things along the way, in particular, what is described as, I think, thinking tools or calculation strategies, depending where you come across them, be it through Lipping Ma or Growing Mathematical Minds, which are effectively things like near doubles. So knowing, for example, that 9 plus 7 can be thought of as double 7 and 2 more, which again is dependent on children knowing their doubles, but it's also dependent on them being able to quickly add 2 to any number, which again means that you have to start thinking about this progression, because you can't teach children near doubles until they've developed this automaticity with doubles, and until they're confident at adding 1 or 2 to any number between kind of like 11 and 20. So you start to have to think about, okay, so what are the steps in here? Equally, I mean, I think the great thing, one of my favorite moments of the last year when it comes to the teaching of mathematics, didn't happen in any teaching that I did or even a school I work in. I was speaking with my partner who's been working in year 7, children who genuinely, you ask them 4 add 2 and their fingers come out at the start of the year. She's now teaching them, having started with a bit of supertizing, which the reason I bring up 9 plus 7 is because she mentioned to a group of kids, she talked about bridging through 10 and showed them that in 10 frames. So here's 7, I'm going to move 1 from here up to here to make this 9 plus 7 into 10 plus 6. She showed them that as near doubles, again, with a visual strategy they could see and that they could apply. And what was fascinating was the fact that one of the lads in her class, who was one of these 4 plus 2 on fingers kids only a few months ago, said, oh, well, I visualized that as 8 at 8. I took 1 off the 9 and added it to the 7, and then I turned it, like showing it with his fingers. He said, oh, I took 1 off here and moved it here. There was no picture anywhere. There was no picture on the board. They weren't at this stage. They were at the point where they were just doing a bit of repetition, as it were, which is still really important. But he was saying, oh, yeah, I think of 9 plus 7 as 8 plus 8. And my partner had never mentioned anything like that. It was just because they started with because she developed their supertizing, because she represented the kind of visual logic behind bridging through 10, through near doubles, this kid had started to play with numbers and was able to do the same thing when you started talking about 90 plus 70, for example, and seeing that as double 80. I can't speak highly enough of the use of calculation strategies as an intermediate step for kids. They still need to do loads of repetition, but you can, I hate to use this phrase again because I've used it a couple of times before, but you can catalyze the whole thing and reduce the amount of repetition they need by giving them these stepping stone strategies like calculation strategies. Lipping Ma talks about these in a fantastic paper called, if you type in Lipping Ma 3 approaches, or if you put that in the show notes, it is fascinating, the comparison between how, I think it's schools in Shanghai teach these kind of number bonds inside 20 and how they build up from number bonds inside 10 to number bonds to 10, to adding 1 or 2 to numbers inside 20, etc., all the way up through in this stepwise fashion over, I think it's 6 to 12 months. And then she compares it to what she saw in American and I think in British schools as well. It might only be American, where it was, okay, here's a load of sums and here's a load of addition and subtraction, get on with it. I've had a lot more success with the calculation strategy approach. I'll just say one last thing. I know I've been jabbering for a while now. I apologise. But there is research out there. I mean, it's interestingly put across in Growing Mathematical Minds. There's a bit from people like Art Barudi, etc. It's worth noting that, I don't know if you would agree with this. I think I might just be regurgitating back to you something you've said to me. I don't think that the research out there is it's a dead cert. I don't think you can say, oh yeah, the research says you have to do it this way and this way works with any level of certainty. But especially not the level of certainty that the likes of, Art Barudi kind of suggest. But personal experience allied to these kind of, having tried to teach it in every way possible over the last kind of 14 years, strongly suggests to me that these calculation strategies, for example, are a really great stepping stone, and that the first stage of these is perceptual and conceptual supervising and the use of things like 10 frames. And and breathe. Yeah, sorry. I know that's a lot to dig into into there.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, because I think the tense frame, it's your friend. I'm just thinking about that. That's an amazing story. That kid's been given the keys to this wonderful place that anyone who can do maths and understands maths, has access to. And now he's joined. He's joined the club, which is amazing because, he could have been written off very easily.
And as I think, I'm not sure if I said it, I mean, this is bottom set year 7, and anyone who's worked in a secondary school will tell you that bottom set year 7 is a difficult thing to teach, because you've often got children that haven't got skills that you assume they should have learned in primary school, stuff that goes right back to kind of reception year 1, year 2 stuff, like, number bonds inside 10. And yet you've got a curriculum in front of you that says, oh, okay, so we're talking about, I don't know, the first steps into algebra, or even if you've got a bit of flexibility, it's usually something like, oh, with this bottom set, teach them from White Rose year 5, and that just doesn't go anywhere near far back enough. I mean, I worked as an intervention teacher for maths and science briefly at the very start of my career with kids of that age, and bottom set kids are utterly switched, often, not always, but often utterly switched off to maths through years of it not making sense. And I'm convinced in a lot of cases, these are perfectly capable children who have missed out on the supervising and effectively, I think it's often supervising, principles of counting, the basics of number sense at the very beginning. And for that reason have kind of missed out. So to hear when Sylvia talks about them kind of enjoying mathematics again, and like you say, feeling like it's theirs, it's not someone else's, this is my strategy, I see this, I see how this works. It really made my day when she told me about that.
While you were speaking, I was thinking about what we've got in place, and because we've mapped out our curriculum from 3 to 11, our year 1 kids, we might be working with 10 until Easter time, possibly in year 1, and then it goes to, we start exploring within 20, within 40, and then within 100, because I know that if they follow the sequence we've got, by the time they get to year 6, they will have a really deep and rounded understanding of that which we've just decided is important for them to understand in terms of mathematics. So I do think your point on focusing on those smaller parts and then reaping the benefits later on is probably the most salient one, because when you can do those smaller bonds, automatically, then it makes larger calculations much more easily accessible. I think, like I said, more chunks, and I think that moves on nicely to where we go to next. So once we've got those bonds, say within and 220 sort of down, what would your next steps be?
I'd say that where we go next with them really is all of arithmetic, or so much of it. I say all of arithmetic. I think that beyond, we have a similar conversation further down the line about the need for automaticity in multiplication tables, though those obviously are to some extent facilitated at first by number bonds. But really, it's things like your number bonds inside 100 with multiples of 10. It's number bonds inside 100 that aren't multiples of 10. So, which obviously leads into things like dealing with money, dealing with measures, etc. I think there are so many aspects of mathematics that we just go, oh yeah, obviously we need that bit of number. There's going to be some addition and subtraction involved there. And all of that stuff, as on the assumption that a calculator isn't coming out at any point, all of that stuff traces its, I'll use the word again, lineage right back to number bonds. I think there's an extent to which there's a value in, like you say, developing them inside 40, developing them inside 100, but also then looking at the ways that, I mean, this goes right back to the start of our conversation where we were talking about, what's the value of them? Because obviously, if you know 7 plus 5 quickly and automatically, you then know 7, or can be through your understanding of place value, you can know 70 plus 50. You can know 87 plus 5. You can know 700 plus 500, 7,000 plus 5,000. You can know 0.7 plus 0.5, etc., etc. And it just keeps on going. And this is, I love sharing with children this idea that, oh, you know 7 plus 5, do you? Brilliant. Okay, what do we know from that? And they start to see that it's effectively an infinite array of facts that can be derived from that. In practice, it isn't infinite, but it's still, from a few basic facts, you have this whole world of mental arithmetic open to you, and also all of this arithmetic that relates to other aspects of maths suddenly becomes easier, and suddenly cognitive resources are freed up for you to understand what's going on and to focus on what you're doing. I guess, that's where I would say it goes next. It's obviously of such importance. I think we can't really underplay the extent to which children having automatic or quick recall of number bonds, the extent to that, the way that opens up the rest of mathematics for them and makes their life so much easier. I guess, to use the commonly expressed analogy, it's a bit like learning to drive. Your number bonds, knowing your number bonds is like being able to use the clutch, the brake, the accelerator, and the gears without having to think, oh, okay, so my left foot goes down here and then I move this to the left. Once that's automatic, automatic's probably not a great phrase to use when I'm talking about a gearbox, but you know what I mean. Once that's you've got that, and it's immediately, you can do it without having to think about it. It's unconscious. Once you can do that, you can concentrate on the traffic. You can concentrate on where you're going. You can understand, and dare I say, to stretch the analogy a little bit, you can turn on the radio, and so actually the process of whatever you're doing can become that little bit more beautiful and enjoyable, not just productive, just not in pragmatic terms. So I think it actually frees you up not just to be better at mathematics, but actually just to enjoy mathematics and to be able to appreciate the beauty of it as well. So I think that is a pretty stretched analogy, but I'm sticking with it.
Is that the point at which knowledge becomes tacit? Is it tacit knowledge that you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think tacit would definitely be a more sensible phrase to use than automatic, given the analogy I was trying to desperately chisel out from somewhere. But yeah, it's obviously, I can't really say more on how valuable these number bonds are. Hence the fact that I guess this is the place to start.
It's when you think about the alternatives that it really strikes you how important it is. Way back in the old SATs, when you could have resources in Key Stage 1, I saw a kid do a count all strategy with cubes, and I think it was 124 plus something else. And it was you couldn't say anything. You were just sitting there sort of in the room while the child worked through this maths. And it was a painful process because you knew that there were 124 plus opportunities for this to go badly wrong, whereas with knowledge of bonds, knowledge of number and that number sense, you can avoid that. Or the sort of the worst option you sit there and you totally disengage with the mathematics altogether because you don't even have a count-all strategy. You just have, this is too much. I don't have the requisite knowledge. I'm not getting involved, and then you're never involved.
It's funny, actually. You should. Now I've just literally remembered the reason why I actually kind of I'm still on Twitter and I'm still engaged with these sorts of conversations, and probably the reason why I've in the long run had this great opportunity to be on your podcast is that I had a conversation about this stuff with Matt Swain about I'd say 18 months ago, and we disagreed at the time, and I think we probably still disagree on it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And it might just be a sign of the schools he's worked in and the great work he's done and the, my inadequacies as a teacher in comparison. But the initial conversation that we had that kind of drew me in was a discussion of, if you went into a year 6 classroom right now, how many of them in your school would you say, obviously not right now, they're not in school, lockdown, yada, yada, yada. But in an average year 6 class, under normal circumstances, how many of the children could you say to them, okay, what's 7 plus 5? And how many of them would just say, it's 12? Or even with a momentary pause would go, it's 12. But quick enough that they haven't put 7 in their head and then gone 8, 9, 10, etc. How many would, and I still reckon, I think Matt thinks it's higher than this. I don't think it is. I would say, honestly, I don't think it tops 50%. I don't think that more than half of kids have automatic recall of number bonds inside 20. From my experience, anyway, I think that most are relying on a count-on strategy still. I think there are very few that are still relying on a count-all strategy, whereby they write down 7 dashes and then another 5 dashes and they count the lot. But I think a count-on strategy, put 7 in your head, count on, often on fingers, is so often the point at where the number one knowledge grinds to a halt. And again, often I think that's because of the lack of opportunities that you've talked about providing in your school to deal with numbers, to develop number sense, to develop their supervising, use of 10 frames, etc. So yeah, in terms of the picture nationally, I think that's where we're at. I think it's less than half of kids in year 6 would, and having spoken with secondary school teachers dealing with year 7, they kind of back me up on that, I think, a bit. I was about to say, does that reflect your experience? But I'd be very surprised if it does now, given the work that you do to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen across schools. But outside of the brilliant work you're no doubt doing, would you say that that's your experience?
I think so. I think it's quite often the pitfall, and I need to go right back. Because technically my role is a Key Stage 2 role. But one of the first things I did was sit down with the early years team and sort of say, this is what we're doing, because I'm not really interested in whether or not I'm still around whenever these kids are feeling the benefit and whether the school's feeling the benefit of the work. But it's because you just know that putting the effort in early on is much, much better than trying to do anything later on. And I think you're right. I think that's where we fall down, is not enough investment at the earliest stage. And obviously we're talking about primary here, but I think we do have people who listen who are in early years, and they'd probably agree that that's where our investment needs to be. I always say that's where our best teachers need to be, and I think it's also where our deepest thinking needs to be, because I think I must have been 2 years in when I heard about the principles of counting, and my mind was blown. And I know that everybody I've spoken to about since, they had the same mind blown moment when they realized just how difficult counting was. And I think that's the solution to, as you say, it's almost endemic that there are so many kids who don't know their number bonds by heart, and as a result are excluded from the world that we know is so beautiful. In as you in your fine car analogy, we can, if you can solve beautiful problems using that the most rudimentary of knowledge, then the sense of well-being and the sense of enjoyment is through the roof. And it can't be overstated how important this is, because not only is it something that we can really enjoy, but it's also almost a minimum for accessing the world and being socially functional. or function in society. I can't stress it enough, really.
I think just the last thing to mention is that I don't want teachers out there who to think that, okay, that this is full stop a panacea, that you put all of these things in place and you barely need to repeat these things. It's just going to fall into their mind. I think there's still absolutely an extent to which that once you've got these in place, and once children have developed number sense, etc., that you still need to do quite a lot of repetition. There's still and specifically little and often repetition, 5 minutes here or there. I think, for example, the app Numbots is one of many ways that you can develop that repetition. And again, that operates seemingly or I think it probably operates most effectively on a little and often way of doing things. You absolutely still need to, there still needs to be that repetition. But I think, again, going back to that, I'm torturing a few analogies today, but going back to this idea of a chemical reaction, you can speed it up, you can catalyze this reaction effectively through the development of children's number sense, through the investment of expertise in the early years, year one, and etc. But in the end, that reaction still needs to happen. Children are going to need to do a number of calculations in order for that to become second nature. So yeah, I just wanted to make that clear as well, because the last thing I'd want is teachers to think that, I did this, and then it didn't just fall into place. I think it's absolutely the case that there still needs to be repetition. It's just, I think you'll be surprised how much less repetition you sometimes need to do with the majority of children if these foundations are put into place appropriately.
Yeah, that's really fair. I think it's very difficult in this kind of context for us to cover absolutely everything, but you've done a really good job there of bringing around. Hopefully, over the course of many episodes, people will see almost a rounded picture. But there's only, we have to be pretty focused. This is our ideal scenario. And you mentioned Numbots. I was definitely going to as well. Because again, this is another thing that I've got in my schools, but had an opportunity to really explore with my own 6-year-old during lockdown, version 1, and how carefully they've crafted the story, from subitizing, 3 cogs.
No, don't apologise. I'm going to interrupt here. Both are fine, I think. I promise I'm not just showing off by saying subitizing. I heard Bernie Westacott say it, and I'm not going to disagree with the man, the legend, Bernie. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was Bernie I was apologising to. Yeah, so, and they've got this...
Oh, well, that's fair enough then. Yes, I'm not apologising to me.
They've got this really carefully crafted journey, and it is that repetition, and the kids want to. What I would say, and we've had this conversation before, the hardest part is getting the kids on because they're so young sometimes. And so having someone responsible for having, a few already partially logged in, and then they can just hit the final bit where they have to, match up their name with the printed picture, and then that almost takes away the laborious stuff, because getting kids that young onto iPads, and often schools will have multiple layers of security before they can get into their iPads. We need to take that away. But once they're on, they really enjoy it. And one thing we do quite well is we get our parents in and we have them playing Times Tables Rockstars with their kids. And we have them playing Numbots with their kids. So then they know, they're going through the process of, this is how we log on, this is what the game's about. But really, it's half an hour of them bonding with their child over maths. And I think that's the way to get the most out of it. But it's superb value for money. Both Times Tables Rockstars and Numbots.
Crazy. It's crazy good when you think of. I mean, I went on not without naming names. I did a bit of CPD the other day, and at the end of it, I genuinely remember, because I got an email about sending someone's password out, etc., etc. I remember thinking, wow, what we spent on Numbots was significantly less than the CPD that I just did that wasn't particularly great. And this is all of the kids that we have across. I mean, the school I work in has 800 plus children, and they're on Numbots, Times Table Rockstars for it's crazy value for money. I'd highly recommend it to any school. yeah, I can't say fairer than that with regards to the app itself.
No, and I think it's because Bruno's heart is in the right place, and what he wants is every child to be successful in maths. And I'll not embarrass him by saying lots of the wonderful things he's done over the years, but he cares so much. And it's not a financial decision he's made to start this wonderful company. He really wants to make a difference, and I think certainly in the case that I can speak to my school's experience, he is making a massive difference through what he's done over the last. I think it's been 10. This is possibly year 11. And it's amazing. So hats off always. I think he's the best of us. In my opinion.
100%. I mean, nothing but admiration for what he and the people who have no doubt worked and supported him have achieved there.
So, as fascinating as listening to us might be, what might teachers read to take their thinking in a different direction on this subject?
Well, obviously, I think I've already referred to it, but I think it's well worth going back to there. I think Baroudi's work in Growing Mathematical Minds. Again, I find it hard to recommend his work too wholeheartedly because he overstates this. I think the certainty that there can possibly be on this subject. But I still think it's a very interesting read. I think Growing Mathematical Minds is the part of the book in there that talks about his work is really valuable. I think the book is valuable generally as well. As I said before, Lipping Ma's three approaches. It's called 3 approaches to one-digit arithmetic. I think it's called a one-digit addition and subtraction. That's a kind of 20 or 30-page paper. Really, really great. You can find that easily online. If I remember correctly, there's some good bits and pieces in, as there is on pretty much all of primary mathematics, in books by Derek Haylock and Coburn, the early mathematics books there, and also his book on primary mathematics explained for teachers, etc. Mathematics explained for primary teachers, I should say. But I would especially go to Lipping Ma. I think the way that she talks about the structured journey in particular schools in, I think it's Shanghai, possibly China generally, it is really eye-opening. It completely changed my thinking on this stuff, and I think it might do that for some listeners as well, potentially.
Nice. I think I was going to go for Haylock as well. And something you did recently, which I recommend anyone, if you're interested in the fact that we were talking about structures, look at Derek Haylock's interpretation of structure, look at the NCTM spines, and then marry the two up and see where they agree and where they disagree, because there are no absolutes. And I think if this is something you're interested in and it's piqued your interest, maybe look at the two together and then see what's going on in that sort of, that tete-a-tete between two really well constructed sort of explanations of structure.
If you can get hold of it as well, or if you can find it somewhere, the scheme, I think Maths Mastery as well, I think they have a very really logical way of looking at things. You're absolutely right. These mathematical structures of structures of arithmetic for addition and subtraction, there is no correct way of looking at these things necessarily. But I think looking at those in and trying to work out what you think is a logical way of putting these together. I mean, I think the structures of arithmetic is a fascinating subject that I think we could talk about again at some point as well. If there's anyone who's listening to this who's particularly fascinated by structures of arithmetic, feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter, because I've got some bits and pieces that I've put together, some CPD videos and this sort of thing that might be of interest. But yeah, really, I think that's a really great recommendation there that you've made.
You say might be of interest, but I know that those videos are very high quality, and that people definitely should reach out, and that's very generous. So I think the next section then is almost an attempt to engage with people's questions on social media, because I've always said that maths Twitter is the best Twitter, and no offense to anybody who maybe I'll cut that bit.
No, don't you dare. And you leave in this bit where you say you were going to cut that bit. You leave that in. Maths Twitter is the best Twitter. you know, I'm happy to what we lose on we lose in one group of people. We get no, you're right. Cut it out.
You know, I've always said that Maths Twitter is a really, you know, supportive collective of minds. So, and I'm very keen that, you know, the conversations we have don't just stop with us and don't just stop with the interviewees. And recently, someone asked, and I won't say who because I haven't really spoken to them about this, but obviously, if they do want in future, you know, it's okay if you use my name in the question. But it was a case of how young would you go with the silent teacher? Because obviously, Neil Almond talked about his use of the silent teacher as one of his key principles in his teaching, one of the key features. And so that got me thinking, you know, how young would you go with that? So I think, let's start with you, Christopher. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because, I think the nature of that particular method, or at least where I first encountered it, or a description of it, was Craig Barton's How I Wish I'd Taught Maths. And so part of me had always assumed it was a secondary mathematics thing, but I gave it a go and had some success with it, I think, in Key Stage 2. And when I started working in Year 2, I thought, well, let's see how this works. Chosen with carefully chosen content, particularly challenging procedures and algorithms, things perhaps with multiple steps. You'll be stunned at how quickly children are saying to you, oh, can you silent teacher that bit? Again, maybe this just reflects on me as a practitioner, that maybe there's an extent to which I need to learn when to shut up and when I'm modeling something. And from this podcast, you might have learned I need to learn to shut up generally. But I found that even in Year 2, with well-chosen content, works fine. I wouldn't dare start saying lower than that, because I think, firstly, I've not tried it lower down the school than that. And then secondly, I also think there are, it has to be so carefully chosen that you almost need to see how it works with an older age group before you go down lower, etc. So personally, I wouldn't want to recommend people use that strategy below Year 2, but I would say that with carefully chosen content, particularly procedural stuff in maths, I think it can work in Year 2 and above, personally. What about you? Where do you come down on this question?
So one of the beautiful things about my job is that I could be anywhere from nursery to 6, and you know, during a given week. And so, but I'd never actually thought about, have I ever used the silent teacher? So I thought about it quite long and hard. And Neil did a really good job in answering at the time, you know, via Twitter. And I've come to the conclusion that I do it, but I don't codify it as the silent teacher with the teachers I'm supporting. Because normally I will codify things so that I can transfer, you know, my practice to another teacher. And I'm thinking about, you know, my favorite examples when talking about maths, aggregation and augmentation. And a large part of is the bringing together. And I know this is a fantastic time for me to choose not to make a video version, but essentially, you know, your aggregation is you're bringing two separate amounts together and you're bringing your hands from side to side, and that matches up with the British Sign Language. Augmentation, on the other hand, you've got one hand out and you bring the other down from almost like an arc on top of it, and that's showing you that you're augmenting the value. And that's almost part and parcel. And I don't think I talked about that until I've modeled it a few times, if that makes sense. And the same with, you know, when you're flipping counters on a 10 frame, you might just have it on the whiteboard, on the visualizer, and you'll quietly flip it over and you'll look to see what the response is to what you've done. You know, you're trying to draw attention and you won't necessarily talk over that point. So then the question for me becomes, should I codify this? Or is it just something that you can't explain? You know, because there's no hard and fast rule for when that will happen. It'll be a decision I make in the second, thinking, okay, right now I just want to see what they're paying attention to without it being my voice.
I think that's an interesting point, because actually, I mean, what Barton defines as kind of silent teacher is quite a specific process that involves kind of tapping with the pen and all these kind of things. Whereas kind of further down the school, it goes without saying that there are moments where you're modeling something where you just think, no, the kids need me to be silent while I do this. Even if it's 10 seconds or 20 seconds, they will benefit from me not yapping for a bit while I show them this. And how that develops from a bit of silent modeling to a, if you like, procedural idea of silent teacher where the children are really familiar with exactly how you're going to model something out, might not be a sudden like click where it goes from one to the other. It might actually be something of a continuum between a little bit of silent modeling because it's beneficial to a stepwise procedural way of doing silent modeling, doing silent teacher. So I guess in some ways there's no correct answer to that, because where it begins to be proper silent teacher depends, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think thinking about it, it had been so long since I'd read Craig's book that I'd forgotten how well defined and sequential it was. So I'm now thinking on the spot, it's silent modeling that's appropriate. And then 100%. Then you call it, you codify it as the silent teacher when you've got those important steps that are outlined in the model of the silent teacher. Yeah, so that's where I stand on it. I think silent modeling, good.
And I'd probably go as far as to say that what I call silent teacher in year 2 probably doesn't marry up perfectly with the particular step-by-step procedure that Craig Barton spells out in his books. So yeah, whether that counts as silent teacher or not, I don't know. It's probably the same thing, but with fewer steps or in a slightly more fluid way because of the nature of the class, with a slightly greater willingness to interrupt if I need to. Just going back very briefly on a point you made there, you were talking about, I think just because this goes nicely full circle with what you were talking about with the structures of arithmetic, augmentation, aggregation, and you visualized the idea of aggregation as things coming together. It's interesting that that's Haylock would kind of look at it that way, whereas say something like mathematics mastery or I don't know with the NCETM. I'm trying to remember. They kind of see it as their view of aggregation is the things are already present. Aggregation is our sets that are kind of already there, whereas augmentation they describe as anything that involves a change in some way. So as soon as you're I know what you mean with bringing hands together. I think you're right. I agree. I think that suits aggregation in all forms, but it's almost like you can already see what's in both of my hands. Now we're thinking about the whole thing. You might want to cut that bit out, but I think that's a potentially interesting aside on what we were talking about with structures, though that might make more sense in a later episode if you ever decided to go that way.
I think you're right. I take my inspiration from sign language because it's 2 fingers out and then they're brought together at the same time, and something like the grammar and the vocabulary of a language doesn't develop by accident. It's this representation of what we understand, and so that's where I'm always tying together our idea of mathematics and representation with also the fact that language is this representation. And so like I said, there's no one answer, but it's a massively interesting area, and I think it's definitely something we should come back to. Chris, it's been fascinating discussing number bonds with you tonight. We'll be back the same time next week. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me on, Kieran. It's a pleasure as always.